Good evening and a welcome on a really wet and windy evening, but we're not going to care about that for a second, because tonight I am so excited to introduce on behalf of ISSP Dr. Carol Robinson, who will be exploring with us what is criminology. I'm really excited by this. We have got so much to learn, so much to explore. Just deep thanks for being with us. So if I can hand over, please, on behalf of ISSP, to Dr. Carol Robinson from York University to talk to us and explore what is criminology. Over to you.
Thank you, Kate. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to be talking to you all today. As Kate said, my name is Carol Robinson. I live in Acomb and I work at the University of York as a lecturer in criminology, which is very simply the study of crime. This lecture is about criminology. Criminology is an increasingly popular subject, especially at university. If you look at the UCAS website, you'll find over 1,100 criminology courses at undergraduate level, offered by a total of 164 UK universities, including the University of York, where I work. Some of these undergraduate programmes are for criminology by itself. Others combine criminology with sociology or law or policing, or teach criminology as part of a broader social sciences degree. In this lecture, we're going to look at what criminologists do and at why criminology matters. I'll talk a bit about how criminology began as a subject and how it continues to develop. Along the way, we'll need to think about what we mean by the terms crime, deviance, and harm, which, as you'll see, are all relevant when it comes to thinking about what criminologists study. And I'm keen to hear what you think, so I'll be asking you some questions later. What is criminology and what is crime sound like really simple questions. In practice, there are several different possible answers, some of which change over time or depend on how you view the world, so it's well worth exploring these questions further. Doing so reveals a myriad of other questions that criminologists continue to ponder throughout their careers. So let's start with what is criminology. One really important thing to bear in mind about criminology, one significant way in which it differs from other subjects, is that it's a multidisciplinary subject. It brings together lots of different subjects and specialisms, lots of different academic disciplines. So you'll find psychiatrists, psychologists, lawyers, historians, sociologists, economists, all described as criminologists. The mixture of disciplines related to criminology can make it really tricky to define what criminology is. A lawyer might think about criminology very differently to a sociologist. They've got different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of studying it and learning about it, different methodologies, different theories that they use. Not only are there different disciplines involved, but also different objects of study. Are we looking at the mind of the individual criminal, as a psychologist might, or at how the society in which crime occurs functions, as a sociologist might? Are we thinking about criminology in terms of what the law says, as a lawyer perhaps would? Some criminologists conduct research using quantitative methods, numbers and statistics. Others use qualitative methods, getting their data from interviews, focus groups, observation, for example. Some criminologists' work is more theoretical. Some criminologists think their work should be political, that it should have a particular political stance or a campaigning edge. Others disagree. Actually, criminologists quite often disagree, particularly across their subject boundaries. So it's worth asking yourself, if you're reading something by a criminologist, where does this person come from? As in, what's their discipline background? What's their take on criminology? I come to criminology as a sociologist, as someone who's interested in how society works, but with a particular interest in how societies think about and respond to behaviour that is seen as criminal or that deviates from what societies think is acceptable from the norm. It's not always a very cheery approach. Criminology looks at some of the bleakest, cruelest aspects of society, although we won't be going there today. Whatever aspect of criminology it is that interests a criminologist, whatever their discipline background, what unites them, what brings them together is the subject matter. Put very simply, as I did at the start of this talk, criminologists study crime. And in particular, drawing on the work of Edwin Sutherland, who was a criminologist in the US in the early 20th century, criminology is the study of crime. What crime happens? When does it happen? How? The study of those who commit crime, so the study of criminals, offenders, there's various terms for them, but the people and sometimes the organizations who are responsible for crime. And it's the study of the criminal justice and penal systems. That is, how do we investigate, judge, and perhaps punish the people or organizations who commit crime? How do societies respond to crime? What do we do after a crime has happened? So criminology is the study of crime, the study of those who commit crime, and the study of criminal justice and penal systems. We have a more detailed list here, which gives us a good idea of what criminologists do and helps us better understand the subject. So criminologists try to measure crime and measure offenders. They analyse the causes of crime. Does crime happen because of factors associated with the individual, such as maybe greed as a motivator behind a theft? Or is it that people commit crime in response to broader factors in society, such as poverty? Criminologists try to understand how laws are formed. What are the social as well as the legal processes that result in something being legally defined as a crime, when something else similar might not be? Criminologists also look at how laws are applied. They ask, are laws applied fairly? Are there some people more likely to be prosecuted? Are some crimes more likely to be taken seriously? And they consider issues around punishment, asking, how do we punish people? But also, what does it feel like to be punished? What does punishment feel like as an experience? Does it have the effect that society wants? And are some punishments fairer or more effective? Criminologists think also about what would prevent crime. Are there things we can do that would prevent someone committing a crime? And is that about the individual, or maybe about the situation, the physical space in which crime happens? So criminologists also explore the impact of crime on victims. What's it like to experience crime as a victim? What impact does it have on someone? What do victims feel about crime? And lastly on this list, criminologists are exploring public attitudes towards crime and the media coverage of crime. So criminologists are addressing questions such as, why does crime happen? How are laws enforced? How do we punish people? What's it like to experience a crime? I think I warned you earlier that we finish up with more questions. But answering these sorts of questions is why criminology matters. How criminologists answer these questions can lead to changes in government policy or to new schemes to support people at risk of offending or who've been the victim of a crime. The work of criminologists can lead to a fairer or more effective system of punishment, or to more honest understandings of how much crime there is in our society, or to new ways of preventing crime and protecting people. Criminology matters because it can help reduce crime, reform our criminal justice system, and change lives. Studying criminology is, for me, important because of what it tells us about society and about the experiences of people who commit or experience crime. There's a bigger question lurking underneath all of these questions. What is crime? It's an important question because, as we've seen, crime is the key word, the key concept or idea at the centre of criminology. If we're about studying crime, studying those who commit crime, and studying the responses of societies to crime, then we need to think about what crime is. Understanding what a society means by the word crime is important, not least in terms of the implications it has for potential victims or offenders and the communities they live in. We'll come back to that question in a moment. But in the meantime, I want to say a little bit about the development of criminology. This is going to be a really quick overview to give us a bit of context. So criminology starts in the 18th century in Western Europe. That's where it starts as a discipline, as a subject of academic interest. It emerges out of what is called the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement in 18th century Western Europe, which embraced the use of reason and the natural sciences as a way of understanding and controlling the world around us. The Enlightenment shifted the search for explanations about how the world works away from religion and belief and towards science and reason. So the Enlightenment was all about being rational, rejecting religious explanations for how things are and looking for scientific explanations. Early criminology was heavily influenced by Auguste Comte, a French philosopher of the 19th century. That's him in the picture with the white background. He developed the idea of positivism, that the study of society should rely on scientific evidence, on experiments and on statistics to show how society works. Comte argued that once you've established and tested your theories about how the world works, it could have a positive influence on the world. Later, in the 19th century, the founder of the Italian school of positivism, who's in the picture with a black background, and who's called Lombroso, took these ideas further. He tried to use scientific methods to study crime, to work out why crime happened, and importantly, who would commit it. Now, that approach wasn't without problems. Arguably, as criminology developed, we started to see two separate streams, two different types of criminology. One of these continued to develop along the lines of Lombroso's work, seeking to identify the characteristics of criminals as opposed to non-criminals in order to understand the causes of crime. The other was what's sometimes talked of as a governmental project, whereby criminology was all about studying the administration of justice, prisons, and the police. And I think I said earlier, criminology is now much broader than that. In the 20th century, there was an important expansion in the role of sociology in criminology, particularly coming out of the Chicago School of Sociology in the US. And nowadays we have critical criminology, the type that's taught in most universities in Europe and in English-speaking countries, which is informed by sociological ideas around power and the use of power. We also have approaches that are based around social structure theories, or around biosocial theories, or rational choice theory, or around many other schools of thought. So Marxist criminology, for example, takes the ideas of Karl Marx and applies them to crime. The late 20th century also saw developments in terms of cultural criminology, which looks at culture and cultural processes to try to understand crime, and is very interested in the cultural meaning that societies place on crime. Convict criminology describes criminological research done by people who have experience of being in prison, people who have been in prison themselves. Queer criminology focuses on LGBT individuals and their interactions with the criminal justice system. Criminology continues to develop, and I've only given you a very few examples. Quite often, new developments in criminology, new approaches to criminological theory are about filling the gaps, accepting that criminology has overlooked certain people, certain types of crime, and seeking to address that failure. For example, early criminology paid little attention to female criminality or to crimes that predominantly affected women. It took the development of feminist criminology in the 1970s to start to address this. The 1970s also saw the development of victimology, a focus within criminology on the experiences of victims and of victimization. Since the 1990s, there's been an emerging field of green criminology, which is concerned with environmental justice, which has broadened our understanding of harm. It's time, I think, that we return to that word crime again. We never really left it, but now is the time, I think, to explore the term more carefully. And I want you to think about some real-life scenarios I've got for you, things you can perhaps imagine happening or have seen happening or have heard about. And I want you to decide whether you think these should be thought of as crimes. So I've got 4 very different scenarios. Firstly, someone you follow on social media has posted racist comments about a footballer. That's the first kind of example I want you to think about. And then the second one, You're having a day out with a friend, and then mum has parked her car on the double yellow lines. You've got out in the car and she's parked the car on double yellow lines, and she's left it there for more than an hour while you've all gone off to get something to eat. The next scenario I'm going to ask you to think about is that your cousin is watching a programme on the BBC iPlayer but doesn't have a TV licence. And then the last one to think about, we're going further overseas for this one. So the last example is a 19-year-old who tries to buy a drink in a bar in California. In each case, the question is, do you think it's a crime? So is it a crime, in your opinion? Should it be a crime for a 19-year-old to try and buy a drink in California? Do you think it should be a crime if your friend's mum leaves her car on a double yellow line for an hour? I'm going to give you a few moments to think about these scenarios. Talk to the people with you in your group. Share your thoughts about each of these scenarios. What I want to know is, do you think this is a crime? So do you think in each of these scenarios a crime has happened? And if so, think about, why is it a crime? Who's committing the crime? Please make note of your thoughts on each of these scenarios, because I'm going to ask you for some feedback. I want to know what it is that you think. So we're going to give you a few minutes to do that. I think maybe if I give you 5 minutes to do that, so you can have time to give some proper thinking about it and talk to the people that are with you. And then when you come back, I'm going to ask for your answers. See you shortly. I hope you have some good discussions about that. We're going to go through each question in turn, and there's going to be a link in the chat to a poll where I'd like you to give me some feedback. So the first scenario was someone you follow on social media has posted racist comments about a footballer. And on the screen, you can now see the link to a poll. So if you can go to the poll, you've got 3 options. If you think it's a crime, yes. If you think it's not a crime, no. And if you're not sure, maybe. I'll just give you a moment or two to do that, and then we'll have a look at the results of the poll. Okay, so that's quite convincingly 81%, 82%, it's going up all the time, said yes. Okay, and so if you did say yes in response to that, yes, you thought there was a crime here, then in the chat, please tell me, who did you think had committed the crime? So who's responsible for the crime here? Looks like someone's struggling to find the poll. You need to type the URL that's on the screen in, and then you'll find it. Okay, the poster. So yeah, people are saying that the person responsible is the person who tweeted the racist tweet, the person who posted the comment. Thank you. Yeah, quite a few people are thinking that. The person you follow, yeah, the person giving racist comments. Absolutely, absolutely. There's a real life example of this. In August 2019, a man was given a 6-week jail sentence that was suspended for 12 months. That means if he was convicted of another crime within 12 months, he'd have to serve the 6 weeks in prison for the first crime. And so as well as this suspended sentence, he was ordered to complete a course on human dignity. And this was after he'd posted a racist tweet about the footballer Mo Salah. The magistrate's court found it was a crime. It was committed by the person who posted the tweet, as a lot of you said, so not by anyone who saw it. And that it was a crime because we have laws against racism that the tweet broke. But we didn't always have social media. This is a crime that would not have been exactly like this if it had taken place, say, 15 years ago. The medium by which the crime is committed has changed, although there were still other ways in which people spread racism and hate long before Twitter. But remember too that racism and hate crime have not always been regarded as criminal. It took years of campaigning to get the harm and hurt caused by racism, the affront to human dignity of tweets, of comments such as this one that was directed at Mo Salah, to get that recognised in law and recognised by the courts. Let's move on to our next scenario then. So you're having a day out with a friend, their mum has driven you out, she's parked her car on double yellow lines and she's left it there for over an hour whilst you go to eat. So again, quick poll, again, 3 options. Yes, you think that this is a crime. No, you think it isn't. Maybe you're not really sure. Again, there'll be a link for you to click on the screen. Not to click on, I'm sorry, type that into your browser. It'll be appearing in the chat as well. And there's a poll there for you to vote on whether you think this is a crime. Just give you a few minutes to do that. And then we'll see the results. Okay. Just a few results coming in, but not such a big majority for yes this time. A few, bit more split. Okay. So quite a few maybes there, and that's really interesting. So can you tell me in the chat again, if you thought it wasn't a crime, or perhaps it wasn't always a crime, could you tell me in the chat why? I'm going to give you a few minutes just to type that. Some interesting comments in there. It's interesting, I think, to see comments around maybe if it's not against, this issue I raised about whether being against the law is a crime or not. That's something we'll talk about a bit more. And this point someone makes, it's dangerous and it goes against the law. So that's what makes it a crime. In many circumstances, parking on a double yellow line is breaking the law. But what if your friend's mum has health problems that affect her walking? And so she's got a blue badge. A blue badge usually lets someone with a disability park for free on single or double yellow lines for up to 3 hours, unless there's a no loading sign, for example. So if your friend's mum didn't have a blue badge, then yes, she could be fined for parking illegally. But if she does, then she can park here for up to 3 hours. Longer than that, and again, she could be fined. Let's move to our next scenario then. So your cousin watches a programme on the BBC iPlayer but doesn't have a TV licence. Is it a crime? And again, there's a poll for you, 3 options: yes, no, maybe. Give you a few moments on that one. And then we'll look at the results. Here they come. So just under half of you at the moment are saying yes. Again, quite a big maybe and a few no's. Still some responses coming in. I'll give that a moment. It was sort of steadying up there. Oh, nice. Still some responses coming in. Okay. Well, for those of you who said yes, well done. This is against the law. Your cousin could be prosecuted. They could be fined up to £1,000. But before the 1st of September 2016, so only a few years ago, if they'd been watching a programme on iPlayer after it had been broadcast, they wouldn't have been committing a crime. The law changed to close a loophole that before that date meant you only needed a licence if you were watching a live programme. One other question to consider, which you might want to think about later, is who is being harmed here? If your cousin watches iPlayer illegally without a licence, where's the harm in that? Semiology, the study of harm, is an important area in criminology and something that has helped in the identification of what we ought to consider a crime. Bear in mind too that the punishments for not having a TV licence are quite politically controversial. I won't go into that now, but what scale of punishment something should have is often something open to a lot of debate. And then finally, a 19-year-old tries to buy a drink in a bar in California. You've got another poll, your last poll for the day, so please vote away. Is this a crime? Do you think this is a crime? Yes, no, maybe. So still a few responses coming in, a larger number of yeses here. And a few suggestions in the comments, if you've got time to look there as well, about who is committing the crime. And some of you have spotted that geography matters here too. Okay, so yes, if the 19-year-old is trying to buy a drink that contains alcohol, then yes, it's a crime. It's against the law to possess or to drink alcohol in public under the age of 21 in many US states, not all US states, but it does include California. If the 19-year-old bought an alcoholic drink in a bar in California, they and the bar owners would be committing an offence. But it's not the same in the UK, where you can legally buy an alcoholic drink from the age of 18. So things you can legally do here at 18, you can't do in California. In fact, the law around what age you can drink varies between states in the US. It's not a blanket age limit. And in some countries, such as Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, you can't legally consume alcohol at any age. My intention with these case studies is not to give you a crash course in bits of legislation. I am not a lawyer. Don't come to me for legal advice. Instead, I wanted you to think about the definition of a crime as something that is not fixed and not universal. What is regarded as crime changes. You now need a TV license for iPlayer you didn't used to. And who is breaking the law could be debatable. You might wish you'd never followed someone who's convicted of posting a racist tweet, but for now, what you did is not a crime. What's illegal in some places, like drinking alcohol in public under the age of 21, might be legal elsewhere. And what's illegal in some circumstances, parking on a double yellow line, for example, becomes something very different if you had a blue badge when you park there. So if you ask what is crime, it initially seems obvious, surely. Most people would say it's behaviour that breaks the law. Indeed, that's some of the comments in the chat are saying that, and that's absolutely fine. That's fine as far as it goes. But there are some problems with that definition, which I think these scenarios have hopefully shown you. Sometimes identifying something as a crime can be trickier than you might think at first. Law changes over time. Some behaviours are newly defined as criminal, others decriminalised. The law reflects what society thinks is acceptable, and sometimes that's in the process of changing. Criminologists have to ask what processes bring about changes to what is thought of as a crime, to what is legally criminal, and importantly, who influences that change. There's a gorgeous summary, I think, of the limitation of relying on the law to define what a crime is. The legal classification doesn't help tell us why certain conduct is defined as criminal. It merely helps identify it. So we can tell that behaving in a certain way, committing a particular action, is criminal because the law identifies it as such. But aren't there some things which, even if the legal system hasn't defined them as a crime, are things criminologists should study because they cause harm, because they create victims, because people think of them as crimes, even if the law doesn't yet? Does how we think about crime have meaning beyond the criminal justice processes? If there was no criminal law, surely we still know that there would be crimes. There's a list on the slide of 3 determining elements of crime, which takes us, I think, beyond the limitations of needing something to be defined by criminal law before we recognise it as a crime. So these suggest 3 important elements to a crime. Firstly, harm, which you might think of in terms of the nature or the severity of the act committed, as well as the kind of victim the act was committed against. How harmful is this? Then, social agreement or consensus. This is in terms of the extent to which there is a social agreement that a victim has been harmed, that what has happened, or perhaps sometimes not happened, has led to harm. And then the third important element is that there's an official societal response. So there's some sort of response from society, whether or not there's a law that specifies that was a crime, whether or not that law is enforced. There's some sort of response to the action or the lack of an action. And this is a useful definition because it recognises that not everything we think of as a crime is necessarily illegal. We're given here a framework to also consider as crime things which cause harm, which society agrees are harmful and where society has a response, even if that's not enshrined in law. So we might think of harm as one of the ways we can understand what crime is. In fact, Sandra Walklake, who is the current president of the British Society of Criminology, says there are 6 ways of understanding crime, of which harm is just one. That's her on the slide. The 6 ways of understanding crime that she suggests are as follows. Firstly, legal, a thing we've looked at already, as in things that are against the law. Secondly, moral. Crime is behaviour that offends against what people think is morally right. that might be enshrined in law, but it isn't always. Thirdly, social. Crime as behaviour which breaks social norms. That might include breaking the law, but it could be this idea of deviance, which we're going to look at in a minute. And fourthly, humanistic. Crime is something which denies basic human rights. Again, it might be enshrined in human rights law, but a humanistic approach to law is looking at actions or omissions that deny basic human rights. They might be enshrined in human law, but not necessarily so, and not everywhere in the world. Next, social constructionist. So behaviour that is defined as criminal by society, by the interaction of people in society. The social constructionist is quite a tricky term, but that's roughly what we mean. Crime as something that society has decided is criminal. And lastly, harm, the idea that we looked at on the previous slide, which we talked about a minute ago. Crime understood as the harm that is done to people. So I'm going to say a bit more about harm. The study of harm is known as semiology, and it's an aspect of criminology that has helped criminologists get a better understanding of crime and to broaden the remit, broaden the area of concern of criminology. Thinking about crime in terms of the harm it causes leads us to a more inclusive understanding of crime. It helps us think about the experience of being harmed by an activity, even if the activity itself wasn't against the law. If we think about crime in terms of actions that harm people, we get a better understanding of the experience of being a victim of crime. And if we think about crime as something that doesn't just happen to the individual, but to communities and to the environment, we start to think about the wrongdoings of states and large businesses, as well as individual criminals. This approach has informed the study of corporate crime, and it's really important when it comes to green criminology, to the branch of criminology that's developed over the last 30 years or so to look at harms that affect the natural environment and non-human species. So we might include there thinking about some crimes against the environment which are against the law, such as illegally dumping harmful chemicals, harmful pollutants. But we might also think about as criminologists about things like testing on animals, which is legal in many circumstances, but leads to harm against non-human species. Often when we think of some of the most harmful events of recent years, we're looking at a mixture of environmental and corporate crime, thinking of perhaps some of the big environmental disasters of recent years. But thinking about harm also helps us to see how certain actions or behaviours become against the law. When people recognise something is harmful, there tends to then be pressure on politicians to legislate against it, to include it in what is legally defined as a crime. Recent examples of this include laws introduced against hate crime, laws that criminalise behaviour such as verbal abuse, harassment or bullying, which is motivated by hostility towards the victim because of their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, disability or transgender identity. Some people think this legislation needs to be expanded to include hate crimes motivated by the gender of the victim too. That discussion is still to be resolved. For the time being, misogyny, a hatred of women, is not included in the characteristics recognised by hate crime legislation in the UK. Thinking about legislation on hate crime and the calls for it to be expanded helps us to understand Sandra Walklake's point that crime is a social construction. Crime is something that society has decided is criminal. As a criminologist whose approach is informed by sociology, this is something that really interests me. The picture on the slide is Niels Christie, who was a Norwegian criminologist. He said, "Crime does not exist, only acts exist, acts often given different meanings within various social frameworks." You might initially think he's a bit crazy. Of course crime exists. What he means, however, is that it is society, it's the interactions between people, the responses of people to events that result in some actions being regarded as crimes and others not. If you think back to our scenarios, I hope you can start to see what he means. What age you can buy alcohol at, whether it's against the law to racially abuse someone, whether different rules apply to parking for people with specific needs, are all up to us as society. There are, of course, some behaviours, such as murder, which is almost impossible to think of as not being crimes. However, there are still some circumstances, such as war or execution in those countries which still use the death penalty, where society does not regard killing someone as a crime. Crime is a label applied in certain circumstances to particular acts or omissions. What is a crime depends on the norms of the society. So when you think back to our scenarios, what we saw that what's legally a crime can be different in different countries where there are different norms. The fact that criminal law varies across countries makes it clear that nothing can be taken for granted in terms of defining crime. What gets defined as a crime is the result of people in complex social groups. People label certain acts as crime, and certain people who commit these acts are regarded as criminals. Who gets to make those decisions? Who decides what it is that's a crime? That's an interesting topic in itself. Criminologists, aware of the limitations of relying on definitions of crime, on legal definitions of crime, have to think more broadly. They tend to consider not just actions which are officially against the law, but also behaviours which people think are harmful, morally wrong, or break social norms. One way of doing this is by thinking about what behaviour society thinks of as deviant. The concept of deviance is very much a social construct. Deviance is not defined by law, although some laws exist to try to address behaviour which is seen as deviance. Deviance can be committed by, it can be seen as criminal or it can be seen as non-criminal, but it's behaviour that doesn't conform with the expected norms of a society, which is often strongly disapproved of by society. It's behaviour that violates the social rules of a group of people, departs from what's expected of the interactions between people. So, for example, in the past, men with long hair or women with short hair were described as deviant by some people, usually people who didn't share their fashion sense. And even now, going to school with no clothes on would probably be seen as deviant behaviour. Put simply, deviance is behaviour that people label as such. It's historically or culturally specific in that it relates to that time or to that place. It's created by society and usually by powerful social groups which make rules which, if broken, constitute deviance. But it's not a quality in itself, it's about the interaction. The same act isn't deviant in all circumstances. It becomes deviant because someone else has judged it as such. Two things to note here. Firstly, as we know, rules are not universally shared. And secondly, calling people or behaviours deviant doesn't mean criminologists think they are bad, just that they deviate, that they vary from what people think of as the norms of a society. Deviance doesn't need to imply criticism or negativity. So, as we've seen, criminologists study not just actions that are legally defined as crimes, but also harms and actions which are regarded by society in general as deviant. They study not just these actions, but also the people who commit them and the responses of society to these actions, particularly in terms of studying criminal justice and penal systems. These issues matter because how a society understands what causes crime, how it responds to crime and deviance, has a real impact on people's lives. The research criminologists do from their various subject backgrounds can reveal things about our society and about the people who commit or don't commit crime, and can shape the lives of individuals and communities. That's why I think criminology is such an interesting subject. Thank you for listening.
Hello. That was amazing. And I've got so many questions, it's untrue. And I can't ask them because it's up to the young people to ask them. Wow. Can you please, and there's been some fascinating stuff tonight from Dr. Robinson, but some fascinating ideas in the chat. Can you please formulate them into a couple of really interesting questions? I've been looking at the chat and looking at the maturity of the discussions of legality and morality and choice. Can you please write some clear questions to Dr. Robinson for the last 5 minutes, please? And that's brilliant. So if you can put those in the chat, And then if Luke if you can put them on the screen, that's brilliant. Thank you. Questions, please. Questions, questions, questions. Ah, Carol, it sounded like you were signing off and we're not getting questions in.
Oh gosh, oh no, that's what I meant.
I know. Dr. Robinson's still here for questions for the next 5 minutes. So if you've got some questions, please put them on. We've got loads of thank yous and saying how lovely it was. But if we've got questions, please put them onto the chat.
Yes, please do. I'd love to hear from you. I'm sorry we can't do this in person. So the chat's the next best thing. So do please put your questions in there.
Right, we've got one from Lisa. Luke, if you can put that up, please. That's a really good question.
So Lisa's asking, how can you tell when people commit a crime by accident and aren't just lying? That's a very interesting question. I think that question's taking us towards the area that what are called the kind of area of criminology that is the concern of psychologists. And psychologists who study human nature, human behavior, and how the human mind works would be really interested in this question of you know, was it accident? Was it deliberate? Are they just lying? And we tend to talk about that kind of specialism of psychologists who are interested in criminology as forensic psychology. And there was no straightforward or easy answers to your question, Lisa. That's what makes it such a good question. That's the kind of question that keeps forensic psychologists really busy. And it becomes important too. So a lot of forensic psychologists work in prison settings. And part of their job is trying to assess whether somebody will offend again. So is somebody ready to be released? Are they still posing a risk to society? And that question of like, when's behavior deliberate? When's it accidental? Are they just lying? That's a really hard one to answer. And one that is still a struggle for psychologists working in criminology and in forensic settings. Do we have another question, maybe? That's a lovely question for Myra. What happens when a member of government or person who creates the law breaks the law? Yeah. We have seen some of this in this country historically. So we've seen various cases where MPs have been prosecuted for crimes, sometimes crimes that were conducted as part of their kind of life as an MP. So if you think of scandals around cash for questions or MPs' expenses, some of those MPs were charged with criminal offences, some of them were convicted. So, and we have this idea, certainly in this country, that nobody is above the law. Part of being a democratic country with a fair legal system, with a fair criminal justice system, is that even if you're in the government, even if you're the person who created the law, you're still held responsible. That's quite an interesting idea, because quite a few criminologists would also say, yes, but doesn't the law get slightly influenced by who makes it? Doesn't it reflect the interests of the people who make it? And that can sometimes be an explanation, I think, for why certain things are enshrined in law as illegal, enshrined as crimes, and other things aren't. So the priorities of the legal system of our criminal justice codes can often reflect the priorities of people making those laws. And that's a lovely question, Blake. Thank you. So Blake asks, has the concept of criminology been adopted worldwide, or is it just in certain countries? Criminology is very different in different countries. It's taught in universities around the world, but it's taught with different approaches, different angles. Some of it is more, what I mentioned earlier, was a kind of governmental project, is interested in the administration of law. and in the kind of the running of prisons, the running of policing. In other countries, like in the UK, it's very much around sort of sociology. There's a stronger tradition of criminology, I think, in the English-speaking universities around the world. And there's a question and a concern, I think, in the minds of many criminologists at the moment about how we broaden out criminology and how we decolonize it, how we take out the kind of colonial past of criminology, and how we study it in a way that hears all voices, hears from all kinds of experiences of crime and criminology. Yeah. So this is a question about why homosexuality is considered a crime in 70 countries and what form of crime would it be considered. I want to take us back to the 6 ways of thinking about crime that Sandra Walklake gave us. I'm sure you've all memorized them, but just in case you haven't, one of those ways, oh, there you go, perfect, thank you, Luke. One of the ways of thinking about how we understand crime is moral. And often a society's understanding of crime, and therefore the laws that exist around that particular activity, are shaped by the kind of moral values of not necessarily the whole of that society, the whole of that community, but certainly of the influential people, the people who've got the power to make law within that community. We need to remember that it's not that long ago that homosexuality was considered a crime in this country. And we know that law changes. And law changes because those moral values also change. Sometimes they're challenged, sometimes actually they're out of date before the law catches up with them. They are not permanent and fixed, but there are many activities that have and haven't, activities is the wrong word, there are many behaviours, many actions which have been regarded as against the law, regarded as a crime in some places at some times, and no longer are. Do we have time, Kate, for another question?
I think we've just possibly got time for 1 or 2, and we've got so many questions on the chat. So, Luke, if you want to choose between one of the last 2, I'll throw it over to you. There's some fabulous ones.
That is a gorgeous question. So, does restorative justice work? I'm going to come over a bit academic here. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to pull the question apart, not in a mean way, because I think it's a great question. I think it's a really good question, but I just want to check that we all understand what restorative justice is. So there are different forms of responding to a crime. There are different ways of thinking about punishing somebody, and there are different ways of thinking about what we want our response to a crime to be, or what we want the response of society to a crime to achieve. And a restorative justice approach is about trying to restore what was damaged, what was broken by that crime. And you can't make everything better. That isn't what restorative justice is about. But crime often involves a damaged or broken relationship, not necessarily between the victim and the offender, but perhaps between the offender and society. And restorative justice is about trying to find a way of restoring that community. It's also about reparation, so the idea of paying something back, of giving some sort of compensation, perhaps to the victim of the crime, perhaps to the society in which the crime happened. So often restorative justice has a couple of elements. One might be some form of compensation, or some form of activity that the person who committed the crime needs to undertake to kind of pay back to their community. But it can also involve a dialogue, a very carefully managed dialogue between the person who committed the crime and the person who was affected by the crime. And that can be a way for the person who's been the victim of the crime to get some answers, to get a better understanding of why what happened to them happened, that can help them get some kind of closure and feel better about the event, certainly feel they can carry on, from the event. But really importantly, it can also help the person who committed the offence, the offender, to understand what impact their actions had, to understand better why what they did is a crime, why it hurt somebody, and why that harm matters. So that's a quick summary of restorative justice. The question of does it work is really interesting, because that then links us into this bigger debate about, well, what do we want our justice system to do? What would it look like if it is working? So is that working in terms of stopping somebody reoffending? And there is evidence that a restorative justice approach can reduce the likelihood of someone reoffending much more significantly than perhaps sending them to prison for a few years can. But there's also, if we think about whether restorative justice is working, we might also say, well, is it working in terms of what the victim needs? And that's also an important consideration here. And I think you can argue that restorative justice works in that regard as well. It's a big, big question. It's a gorgeous question to end with, actually, Kate, because it takes us right to the heart of how we understand harm, how we understand what our criminal justice system is about, how we understand how to prevent harm in the future, and how to respond to it when it happens. Great questions, lovely questions. I've seen others in the chat. It looks like we could have a conversation for the rest of the day. That's a good place to end. Okay, this is your what next. If you want to answer some of these questions and take criminology further, then Fiona is asking this lovely question: what high school results and subjects are needed to go on to study criminology at university? It depends on which institution you want to go to. At York, you could be going an A-level route, you could come a BTEC route. We've got some widening participation schemes as well. At York, you can study straight criminology. You can also study sociology with criminology, and our entrance requirements for those are slightly different. You could look to do criminology if you think you might want to join the police service. There are criminology with policing degrees around as well. There's 164 UK institutions offering some form of criminology. So if you're interested in taking this further, there's probably a kind of particular take on criminology that would suit you. And there'll be a variety of grades that are being looked for. It can be helpful to have done some of the social sciences, some of the humanities subjects prior to going to university to do this, but there's quite a few options here for you. There will be open days. There's more information. So this is my plug. I'm getting my plug in at the end here. There is more information on the University of York's website about what courses would be relevant, what grades we're looking for. In the interest of fairness, I should say that information is available on other university websites too. I think it's a fascinating subject. I would very much encourage you, if you're interested in it, to explore what your options might be for the future. There are plenty of big questions, plenty of juicy topics to explore in criminology. And as I said, it's a subject I think that really matters.
We've overrun. And quite honestly, those questions were amazing. And I just wanted to answer loads of them, and they were brilliant. Carol, thank you so much. That was informative. It was fascinating. It was full of absolutely brilliant things to think about and thought-provoking. Young people, thank you so much for all your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't get round to all. Carol, we can't give you a round of applause because we are on this platform, but mentally we are all giving you the biggest round of applause going. Thank you so much for your time and your information. And I will be asking you back pretty please, so we can answer a load of those questions. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the technical support from Boodham School. We genuinely couldn't do without it. Thank you very much indeed, and good night, and thank you.
Thank you.